That's our schedule over the next few hours. Thanks for being with us. Up next, a forum sponsored by the Brookings Institution on a Palestinian perspective on the impact of the uprising in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
Good morning, I'm Judith Kipper. We very rarely have good news from the Middle East, but this morning at least the hijacking is over and people are safe. It's a pleasure today to have with us Jonathan Kuttab, who is visiting the United States from Jerusalem. He is a lawyer, University of Virginia. He is the co-director of Law in the Service of Man, a human rights organization. And he's going to talk today a little bit away from the headlines to try to give some meaning to those events in the uprising, about the impact of the events in the West Bank on Palestinian society, what is happening within Palestinian society, which up to now has been a very traditional society. Jonathan, it's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Are these mics not working? David, can you help us? Can you speak loudly until the mics are...
Okay. I have often said that those who work with the Middle East realize, maybe more than most, that very significant factors in that situation pertaining to peace, security, justice, and the rights of people operate in a long-term fashion and are often underestimated or ignored by politicians and even news analysts. And nowhere is this more true than in the case of the Palestinians, because to all outward appearances, the Palestinians, who in my view are central to the entire situation, appear to be the weakest element in the equation and the least able to affect day-to-day events. And the United States, sometimes the government of Israel, and also other governments in the region, often either de-emphasize or ignore the Palestinian element because it cannot be translated into specific material factors that can impact the situation directly and that should be taken into consideration. This uprising is one of those events that, in retrospect, seem almost inevitable. In fact, those who are really in the know will tell you that the most surprising thing about it is that it waited so long in coming, that anybody could have seen that that situation is unstable, that the Palestinian community had within itself the ability and the resources to totally destabilize continued Israeli occupation, that unless the just demands of the Palestinian people are addressed, it would be impossible for Israel to secure its own survival or security, much less its position in the region. Since the beginning of the uprising, much has been written and said and observed about the impact of the uprising on the international scene, on Israel's image abroad, on the support that it can continue to get from the Western world, on its own identity, its own values as perceived by Israeli society as well as the Western world. And I will not go into that because probably most of you in this hall could probably address that situation better than I can. You are familiar with the factors pertaining to it. Maybe more significant, but also quite observable, is how the uprising has impacted the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the balance of power there, Israel's own assessments, as well as other people's assessments of the impact of continued retention of the occupied territories. All of a sudden, that area which was easily governable with a minimum of resources became quite a heavy burden, and the Palestinians, without benefit of weapons, were able to show that they have the resources to make the occupation not only less profitable, but even costly and probably a losing financially proposition, and to impose tremendous burdens on Israeli society as well as on Israeli security in order to maintain the occupation. And potentially it has shown how Israel cannot hope long-term to have internal security within the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, much less within the context of the larger Arab-Israeli conflict, while it has within its borders a hostile population of large numbers who are willing and capable of mobilizing, acting in a unified fashion, and rendering themselves ungovernable, and Israel ultimately insecure. But really the most significant thing about this uprising is the impact that it has had within the Palestinian community. And it's an impact that is of continuing effect. Something happened to the Palestinian community living under Israeli occupation that is nothing short of revolutionary, that has so transformed and radicalized the way people act and interact, that produced and introduced such a new consciousness into our thinking and relationships that one can intelligently speak about pre-intifada, pre-uprising, and post-intifada thinking, perceptions, and manner of doing things. We are already now into the 5th month of this uprising, so we can in fact analyze it with a little bit more accuracy than we could in the first few weeks. And we can observe certain trends and certain factors that began out in the street with the children who were naive, uninformed, unrealistic, but who had a new spirit within them that challenged and confronted that occupation, and that they were able not only to sustain but also to infect the rest of Palestinian society, their elders, their institutions, their leaders, and whose continuing impact is slowly spreading even to the Palestinian community outside and its leadership. I will try to point out what I think are some of the significant aspects of this new reawakening, maybe give a few examples, and then leave most of the time for questions and answers, since I can see that most of you are fully knowledgeable in that situation. and we can proceed at a much higher level of discussion of the internal factors. The first and the most obvious element and factor was what I call the shattering of the barrier of fear, the removal of the internal inhibitions that had been implanted within the Palestinian psyche, within the individual and collective thought processes of every Palestinian, where through Israeli measures, sanctions, administrative punishments, license and permit requirements, strong and effective regulation of every aspect of life, consistent, thorough, and far-reaching economic, social, and political sanctions, violations of basic rights, the Israelis had reached the point where we as individuals and as a collective were paralyzed by fear, had internalized the prohibitions of the occupation. I remember one Palestinian coming to me and saying how desperately we need in the West Bank machines for eggs and turning eggs into chickens. I forget what the technical term. Incubators. Because he said the Israelis are fully controlling our poultry farms in the West Bank because we don't have incubators. And I told him, wait a minute, I've read all 1,200 military orders, and I've never come across one that prohibited the import or setting up of incubators. Why don't you simply purchase one and set it up? And his response, very typical of pre-Intifada thinking, was, I'm sure the Israelis would not allow it. It competes with them. It's against their interest. Therefore, this fellow did not even bother to try and set up an incubator. The economic need for it was there. The feasibility was tremendous. It would have been very profitable. But he was so convinced of the thoroughness of Israeli control and regulation that he would not even bother try. This paralyzing fear, where Palestinians were regulating themselves and controlling themselves and censoring themselves, was shattered by those kids out in the street who went out there against all common wisdom that said we are totally helpless, there's nothing we can do, defiantly confronting the occupation and its authority, and effectively neutralizing its overwhelming military power by simply saying, we are ready to die. We are no longer afraid. We have our courage. And they so radically turned the tables that the soldiers were afraid of them. And every single measure that has been undertaken by the military authorities since the beginning of the uprising has had one primary goal in mind, which was clearly stated by both Rabin and Shamir: to restore that barrier of fear, to restore the deterrent power of the IDF. It is intolerable to them that Palestinians are no longer afraid of soldiers. The policy of beatings, for example, was not introduced as an alternative to shooting. It was there to restore the imbalance in psychological relationship that had occurred between the Israeli soldier and the youth in the street. I don't need to tell you that all the measures that have been used, and they have been extremely harsh, quantitatively and qualitatively, have utterly failed, and if anything, have reinforced that courage and the sense of empowerment that comes with it. The feeling that all the old restrictions no longer hold, that once we are willing, there is nothing that can stop us. We can do it. A second radical change that has occurred was the new unity, a practical, pragmatic unity that had taken a hold of the Palestinian people and that had permitted Palestinians of different ideological stripes, of different classes, from different geographic locations, of different ages, to work together in unity and in solidarity and put their differences aside. Even the basic differences between what used to be called the nationalist camp and the religious fundamentalists were also overcome as both groups and all groups worked together and with independence towards the common goals. A third change that occurred and that has now permeated Palestinian society on the inside, but that has not quite reached, I'm afraid, sectors of Palestinian society living outside, including some of the leadership. But it will. Is a feeling that we can do it and we must rely upon ourselves. We as a Palestinian people, thoroughly convinced of the rightness of our cause, for a long time have adopted an attitude of sit and wait. History is on our side, time is on our side, God is certainly on our side. Somehow the world community owes it to us to redress the injustice that was done. And we were waiting for the international community. We were waiting for the superpowers to agree and impose a solution on us. We were waiting for the United States to pressure Israel into recognizing our rights. We were waiting for the Arab world to come to our rescue, for the Arab masses to rise against the Arab regimes, to fight Israel. We were waiting and waiting and waiting. We even invented a wonderful term for it. It's called sumud, steadfastness. We are hanging in there until salvation comes. And all of a sudden, those children who were not as realistic as we were, who did not seem to realize what we were up against, decided that waiting will not do anymore. We have to take our fate in our own hands, and we have, if we want to be free, we have to go out and work for our freedom now, regardless of the obstacles. And they did it. And they went out there, and at the beginning we said, how long can they sustain this? Is this one of those cyclical waves? Is it going to be for a few days or maybe a few weeks? And I remember the shock with which somebody announced that the plan is really to sustain this until March the 30th, Land Day. Wow, that's 2 months away, or it was then. Now it's history. And now in its 5th month, the uprising has more momentum and is escalating at a time when the Israelis have done just about everything, I think, short of massive genocidal moves, to try and put an end to this uprising. They have tried just about everything and have failed. If anything, the uprising today is stronger than before. So this lesson of not waiting, but doing it ourselves, is another element of revolutionary thinking that has infected our people. Maybe this is the definition of truly revolutionary action. not that it takes up the gun or is violent, etc., but that it refuses to accept the givens of traditional wisdom, of accepted facts, of limits within which everybody feels they must operate. And maybe it takes children to start something like that. But I'm here to tell you that whatever it was has already spread throughout Palestinian society on the inside and is on its way to the outside for the rest of the Palestinian community. That's powerful. A fourth element closely related to this third one is a new sense of solidarity and generosity and a spirit of giving instead of receiving. I'm sorry that over 40 years we have been turned into a nation of beggars, waiting for outside assistance from UNRWA, from the United Nations, from the Arab countries, from the steadfastness money, from international organizations. Receiving. Over the last 4 or 5 months, we have learned again the joy, the beauty, the wonder of giving, of contributing, of sacrificing not only of our blood and of our individual suffering, but also of our money and resources. And I'm sure all of you have heard endless anecdotes about how very poor elements in society were sending contributions to poorer elements yet. How people in refugee camps in the West Bank were sending money and food to Gaza, where they are hit harder. And I'm sure you all know about that phenomena, which, as far as I know, has not really been paralleled in other periods of history or other places, of landlords forgiving rent, deciding voluntarily on their own, even before there were any published requests or requirements or instructions, for landlord to give up rent. But this new spirit of giving and sacrifice and solidarity and reliance on our own resources and willingness to accept a drastically reduced standard of living, I think is revolutionary. People today in the occupied territories are looking to the future, want to sustain this uprising for the long haul, are talking about home economics and home industries, about planting vegetables and food in their own gardens. The Israeli measures of economic repression and control and preventing money from coming in from the outside and making it difficult for people to cash their checks, I think will also backfire. It already has. It's strengthening this particular element of revolutionary change where people are now interested in relying upon themselves and upon their own resources. A fifth element is the new found organization, discipline, and self-restraint that is best expressed through local grassroots committees that have sprung up in every village, in every refugee camp, in every town, that take care not only of the day-to-day struggle, but also the economic needs of the community whether it's in collecting contribution or seeing that they get to the neediest parties, but also local community defense, decision making, setting up alternative institutions, carrying out in detail the broader instructions that are issued by the Unified National Coordination of the Uprising Committee, so that in every place we are beginning to see people taking upon themselves the tasks that are required to sustain the intifada. And people are doing it in a most restrained and disciplined fashion. The stores open and close at the times set by the local committees. The Israelis try desperately to smash this organization, to force the merchants and store owners, who used to be the weakest link in this chain, to open and close at different times than the ones set by the committees, and have failed again and again. People are willing to risk tremendous financial and personal losses rather than break the national will. People get great pride out of the fact that we open at 8 in the morning and let's say close at 11 a.m. rather than opening in the afternoon as the Israelis may want us to. At some points it looks like a children's game. We want you to open at this hour. No, we want to open at that hour. And it's funny to see the military government involved in it. But at its roots, it's a battle of wills. Who controls? Can they command our obedience anymore? Can they force us through sanctions, threats, punishments, banishments, beatings, torture, curfews, cutting off fuel, cutting off food supplies, cutting off electricity? Can they force us to obey them? Or is our will to determine our own fate stronger than their power of coercion? So far, I am pleased to tell you that in this battle of wills, we are winning. The people are winning. And they have adopted methods of struggle that were almost unthinkable a few months back. Where did this cohesiveness come from? Where did this tremendous discipline come from? Where did this self-restraint come from? And self-restraint is significant because the common wisdom used to be that we could not carry on a nonviolent struggle, that there will always be hotheads among us who will use violent means, especially when constantly and continuously confronted. Now, I'm sure some can argue, probably accurately, that stone throwing is itself violent. A stone, if it's large enough and thrown with sufficient force and hits the precise target, could probably kill someone. And that's how Goliath was killed. But relatively speaking, and within that context, the stone is almost nonviolent. In fact, its primary significance is not in that it successfully injures the Israelis, but in its being a gesture of absolute defiance. And you see those children throwing rocks even when the soldiers are way out of range. I heard a story in Gaza about a blind old man. There was a demonstration outside. He went outside his home and grabbed the rock and says, "Somebody please point me in the right direction." It's my heart's desire before I die, I just want to throw one rock. But this discipline has reached the point where people in distant villages who get a hold of weapons, whether they take them from collaborators who are repenting now, or whether they take them from settlers who either ran out of ammunition or were overpowered, they don't use those weapons. They don't hide them for another day. They literally crush them and break them. Where did that come from? That spirit that says, we don't need weapons, we are strong enough. We realize what it means to enter into a firing match with the Israelis. Where did this maturity and wisdom and sophistication come from? I don't know. But it seems to have permeated a whole people. People are very self-restrained, are very mature in their methods of struggle. And the final point, because I see my time is running out, is that people now are open to new ideas. Pre-Intifada, there was a paralysis of action and a paralysis of thinking, and a paralysis on political terms, and almost a prohibition on new ideas. Of course, there were always a few brave souls who nonetheless spoke out and explored different things and tried to set up new institutions. But since the Intifada, everything is now permitted. Any new idea can be tried. You don't need to get a green light from X, Y, or Z. You don't need to first obtain a national consensus. You don't need to overcome all obstacles. If you have an idea, let us try it. If it works, well and good. If it doesn't, we'll push it aside and keep on. This new openness, this new spirit, these new organizations that are springing up all over the place, grassroots organizations. The challenge is now being put, that was put first by the children, and that is now spreading throughout society. The challenge is now put to every person, to every institution, to every class, to every sector. Either you get on with it and do something that is the moral equivalent of stone throwing, something to make you worthy of the challenge that those children have presented, or you will simply be bypassed. People don't even have the time and the energy to criticize you and to push you aside or to supplant you. You will simply be bypassed as the people get on with the job. That is powerful stuff. This is history in the making. These are things that we can see right before our eyes, and they are so drastic and so revolutionary, it's almost crazy to think that we are even part of it. But it's happening, and it's been sustained, and it is continuing. And the challenge that it presents within Palestinian society is continuing. The opportunities that it presents to those genuinely interested in resolution and peace are tremendous. The Israelis, I think, today are being confronted with major decisions and major choices that could either achieve for them peace, security, recognition, and acceptance, or that would commit them irrevocably to a disastrous road of suicide and self-destruction. I was told to strictly abide by time, so I will stop here, but I hope that from your questions I'll be able to make whatever other points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Dan?
I'd be
Please identify yourself.
Dan Kurtzer from the Department of State. I'd be interested to hear more from you about the way and when the Intifada will translate its ideas into political action. Now, I'm not talking about the old notion that perhaps the West Bank and Gaza will act independently of the PLO. I'm talking more about Palestinian political goals, what the Intifada seeks, when it might articulate a program which could form a basis for a political process with Israel.
I think that that depends on several other factors than the Palestinians. I think partly it will depend on the Israelis and their response. It will also depend on the thoughts and the spirit of the Intifada infecting the Palestinian people who live outside and elements of the leadership. And I think it also depends on other players. When you are talking about translating the Intifada into concrete political changes, I think that requires several players, not just the Palestinian people. I can tell you some things that the Intifada has made no longer tenable. It has made no longer tenable the Israeli position that we can live with the status quo indefinitely. I think that that was shaken in a very major way. What is the Israeli response? I don't know. A second notion that was thoroughly demolished, I believe, by the Intifada is what used to be called the Jordanian option, which after this Intifada is no longer tenable even for Jordan itself. The only people who still think it may be tenable are Peres and Schultz. Very significant actors, but the Jordanians don't think it's viable anymore, and the Palestinians don't think it's viable anymore. And perhaps the cardinal problem with the Schultz initiative is that he's trying to get Hussein and Peres again to see how they can jointly rule some parts of the West Bank. Nonetheless, there is something in your question which I have not yet responded to accurately, I believe. The Palestinian feeling within the occupied territories has not translated into a clearly articulated political solution. But I can tell you that the general mood, the general consensus within the occupied territories, according to my reading of it, is towards a two-state solution, towards setting up a Palestinian independent state within the occupied territories, side by Israel. But the people on the inside are very careful that such an articulation should not come from individuals within the occupied territories, but from the entire Palestinian people represented by the PLO leadership. Yasser Arafat has been more clear about that than he has ever been before. In the New York Times, for example, where he articulated this position.
Take the mic.
Jonathan from the BBC Arabic Service. Jonathan, two quick questions. One, to what extent is the death of Abu Jihad going to have an effect on organisation on the West Bank? And two, you talked about alternative institutions with the resignation of the police and tax collectors. How is money being gathered, and what are the alternative institutions?
Okay. I was not in the occupied territories when the death of Abu Jihad occurred. My reading of the situation is that this is yet another futile attempt by the Israelis to put an end to the uprising. They are trying now political assassination of personalities within the hierarchy of the PLO who are perceived to have the most contact with the uprising. My assessment is that, like all the other previous measures, while they may hurt and increase the suffering, they will end up being counterproductive in terms of trying to put an end to the uprising. They will only increase the determination of the people and escalate the ongoing uprising. The alternative institutions that I have referred to are very much grassroots attempts to deal with day-to-day problems, whether it is the supply of food, providing the protection for the communities, or the services that are no longer given by the Israeli authorities. In fact, the crime rate has drastically dropped since the police have resigned, because it has never been one of their major concerns to curb common law crimes and ensure public safety. Most of the criminal elements in Palestinian society were already involved in one way or the other in collaboration with the authorities. And with the resignation of the police, they probably lost some of the protection they used to enjoy. In fact, there are no cases of lootings. Cases of harassment of girls, for example, on the street are almost unheard of now. Cases of common law crimes, theft, burglaries, etc., have dropped to almost nothing since the uprising. And the Palestinian community is now taking care of itself. But even beyond that, I can now see that as the courts become paralyzed, and as the judges resign, which I think is going to be a step in the near future, you will begin to see arbitration boards, community-based, for resolving civil disputes among and between Palestinians. Already we see medical services being provided, a whole network of social services to take the place of whatever was provided by the Israelis before, which was very little and insignificant. But even in things like the field of education, where the Israelis have forced the schools shut and have resisted attempts by students and teachers and parents to return to school, we are already hearing of individuals who are starting to teach children in their homes, teachers who are setting up classes, people who are preparing homework sheets for students to do, and even very ambitious projects of setting up a Palestinian Tawjihi curriculum to replace the Jordanian and the Egyptian one. Such an ambitious project, which would have been unthinkable 5 months ago, is now being actually worked upon. The Palestinians are beginning to take care of themselves. We may be even able to declare unilateral autonomy pretty soon. This is the spirit of the people. This is what is going on.
Helena?
I'm Helena Cobb, and I'm a guest scholar here at Brookings this year. Jonathan, I'd like to first of all thank you for the eloquence and clarity with which you expressed your case this morning. I can say from my own visit last week to the territories that every word that you spoke was true, but you put it much more eloquently than I could ever do. And especially, I want to just underline a couple of points that you made. This one about the dignity and the self-restraint of the uprising was something that was evident from our visit. This time last week on the Wednesday, I stood with a group in East Jerusalem, a group of Palestinians who were commemorating a moment of silence in memory of the dead people who were killed in Beta village. And just to see how these people who were all busy would gather together from their rooms, from their offices, and come together and have a moment of silence far away from Beta was just very moving to me, and a symptom of this new feeling of national unity that you talked about. I think you're right that the Palestinians have seized the moral and political high ground. And my sense was that the Israelis are flailing around, trying to deal with this, trying to get a hold of the monster, trying to find out whether it's by 5,000 arrests or whether it's by deportations or whatever, trying to break your people's will. But you still do have the political and moral high ground. I want to know from you whether you have a sense that by having got that high ground, you should actually use it to reach out. I know that you said that this element of self-sufficiency is very important, and I sensed that from all my contacts last week in the territories, that this idea that the Palestinians can do it on their own was something that's almost intoxicating in its power for the people. But that once you've done it on your own, you have a responsibility to reach out to those elements in Israeli society, the Israeli, if you like to say, man and woman in the street, who, although it's hard to imagine, actually entertains great fears about your presence and about your uprising, and how you can see a way of reaching out to those people to reassure them that the two-state solution is something that is to their benefit as well as to yours. Yeah. And then I just want you to address this question of how you see the dynamic of the uprising, whether you see it kind of just continuing on a slowly upward slope until eventual victory, or whether you have any sense of foreboding that there might be violent and radical reversals. I think you're right when you say that the status quo ante can never be restored. There is no status quo ante. There is no possibility of that calm, stable, profitable for the Israelis status quo ante. But is there a sense that maybe everything will get horribly crushed? Is there a sense that the deportations we're seeing now might be just the tip of a bigger iceberg of population transfers, which is an idea which is being talked about much more openly inside Israeli society?
Okay, I'll try and address the first one, the first question. Attempts to reach out to Israeli society. I think that Palestinians realize the need to reach out. After I left, I heard that there were pamphlets being written and prepared to address soldiers, to assure them that the goal of the uprising is not the destruction of the State of Israel, but the attaining of liberty and freedom for the Palestinians. And I know some individuals who were never involved in any form of dialogue, who suddenly felt moved to open channels of dialogue with Israelis across the pages of the Jerusalem Post, for example. Dr. Mamdouh Al-Akir and a whole number of other Palestinians have started writing full-length articles addressed to the Israeli people to try and communicate with them. But as a person who's been involved in dialogue for a long time, I know how difficult a process it is. And I know how difficult it is to communicate when the other side doesn't really want to hear a particular message. I think that the self-restraint of the Palestinians is probably the most eloquent statement that can be made. The behavior of the villagers of Beta, for example, who in the face of clear provocation and murder captured those guns and broke them and smashed them, tried to hide some of the teenagers and protect them in their homes, and the others who could have easily been all killed during the 2 hours until the army arrived, to have escaped with very slight injuries, except for that one guard who was severely injured. I think that self-restraint is a clear message to the Israelis. I agree with you that I'm not sure it has reached its target successfully. And maybe we have to think in more creative terms how to communicate to the Israelis. But ultimately, just like a revolutionary change occurred in us, I think there is a need for a revolutionary change of heart on the other side as well. And I don't know what it takes, but I think this is the essence of the choice that is facing them. Maybe the futility of military power in crushing the uprising is going to face them with two choices and none other. Either you are willing to recognize and come to terms with Palestinian nationalism, with this will to be free, and try and arrive at an accommodation with it, or you must seriously consider what I referred to a little earlier as genocidal steps, whether it is mass transfer or major massacres or other measures that are infinitely more repressive than we have seen so far. Because all other options have been eliminated. There can be no status quo. King Hussein will not come in to police the territories for you. You must either make your peace and come to terms and make compromises with Palestinian nationalism, with the PLO, along the lines of Palestinian statehood, or you must consider the futile, in my opinion, attempt to physically eliminate and remove from the scene the entire Palestinian people. You can no longer fool yourself into thinking it's a few outside provocateurs. You can no longer fool yourself into thinking that economic measures, mass arrests, beatings, a few deportations are going to do the trick, because they have failed, evidently. Problem is that many military people have the false wisdom that if it doesn't work, you have to do more of it. Maybe it'll work then.
Graham, please stand and identify yourself.
Graham Wisner, Ginsburg Feldman. Can you talk to us briefly about how the young leaders of the uprising relate to the leaders of old, Naif Hawatmeh, George Habash, and if there was a settlement conference, who would then claim to be the legitimate representative of the new Palestinian people?
Well, the young people will tell you that our sole legitimate representative is the Palestine Liberation Organization. But the old image prevalent in the Arab world of a hierarchical structure where the president or king, or in this case Arafat, issues orders to his lieutenants, who issue orders to their major operatives in the occupied territories, to issue orders to their members to motivate the Palestinian street to do X, Y, or Z. That model, if it ever existed, no longer operates. Our understanding of the relationship between the Palestinian people and the leadership outside is an organic, dynamic relationship, where we make our wishes and interests known, and where the leadership can lead and can order and is obeyed precisely because and to the extent that it represents us and our wishes and our needs and our aspirations. So that the average child in the street will tell you, of course, the PLO is our representative. Of course, what they accept, I am willing to accept. But then they'll go on to tell you, I am the PLO. We are the PLO. The PLO is us. So that the PLO does not obtain its power and its legitimacy because it is out there and up there over us. It obtains its legitimacy and its representative character precisely because it accurately reflects our feelings, interests, and wishes. Now, the Israelis have tried to make that difficult by making it illegal for individuals to have direct or indirect contacts with known PLO leaders. And of course, that means that the mechanism of how that communication occurs and how that organic relationship continues becomes significant. And maybe that is why the murder of Abu Jihad becomes an interesting element for the Israeli authorities, or they think it's significant. But the fact remains that the PLO leadership outside cannot and will not accept what we find unacceptable. And that for them to continue as they are, our legitimate representatives, they must represent us and also the rest of the Palestinian people in the diaspora. There seems to be a division of labor now, as people on the inside carry out the day-to-day protest activities, while delegating and relegating to the leadership outside to carry out the political steps necessary to reap the benefits and to realize the political fruits of the uprising. But the situation is more organic and dynamic rather than hierarchical. This has been the power of the PLO so far, and this is what gives it its legitimacy. That is why anybody who is trying to look for any alternative to the PLO, I think, is totally mistaken.
Certainly, among the major changes that has taken place over the course of the period since December is that you are on the offensive, and for the first time, Israel is on the defensive. You have changed the equation around, you have turned it upside down. I think when Sadat succeeded in doing the same thing after the 1973 war, he was able to seize the moment to change also his diplomatic strategy. I think there are a number of us here are hoping, not necessarily that the PLO will emulate Sadat. We're not talking about that. But in some measure will transform this new power into some new diplomatic strategy, because the old one has failed for so long. You spoke about how audacity is now sanctioned in a manner that it never was in Palestinian society. And yet it still seems as if Arafat, and leaving aside whatever significance the assassination of Abu Jihad has, but it seems as if the PLO is not really changing its strategy. I don't see any new sense of initiative. Perhaps I'm not perceiving correctly. But the moment, the context is different from anything that you have enjoyed since '67, perhaps since '48. The leadership, unless I'm mistaken, is not seizing that. And I'm wondering what kind of sense is coming out of the West Bank, what kind of scenario you might envisage to transform that situation, which may in fact be a mechanistic one, but still may be crucial to the resolution of this problem.
Well, what I'm sensing from a lot of the questions is a feeling that you would like the PLO and the PLO leadership to do something. And I can say that I would also like the PLO leadership to do something. I felt that the instructions by the PLO to refrain from the use of weapons showed that they are clearly in tune with the spirit that is happening in the West Bank now, at least on that level. I felt that in the interviews to the New York Times, Arafat was articulating even more clearly than ever before the PLO's willingness to look for mutual recognition with Israel, its willingness to go and negotiate with Israel within the context of an international conference, its willingness to recognize in a mutual fashion, to enter into a mutual recognition. It seems to me perhaps that while we all would like to see more being done by the PLO, something should also be addressed to Israel and Israeli leaders, as well as American leaders. I think we are in a new situation. Although the factors seem to be the same, we are in a new situation. Unfortunately, a lot of the major players continue to act with pre-intifada conceptions, with pre-intifada ways of doing things. I don't know what it takes to get the American administration or the Israeli people or some of the leaders of the PLO to start acting in a new way. I am more hopeful that the leadership of the PLO, which is in touch and in communication, is slowly being infected with this new spirit. But I do not think that it will reflect itself in ways that you may want. I think when the PLO leadership fully catches the spirit of the uprising and starts acting with a new lack of fear, destruction of old assumptions, self-reliance, already the unity, I think, is very evident there. You may not like what you will see, because they can and they will act in radically new and revolutionary ways. It is my hope, of course, that major new diplomatic initiatives can be undertaken. Serena Sebe has openly called for the PLO to take a bold new initiative, for example. I would like to see such a bold new initiative. I think it will take the form of even clearer statements of willingness to mutually accept and recognize and deal with and negotiate with an Israel that is also willing to recognize, accept, and deal with the PLO. I seem to think that those statements have been made. Maybe they have not been made forcefully enough. Maybe the world does not want to listen to such statements, and they get buried away in a column by Anthony Lewis on the inside pages of the New York Times. But that's all I can say on that.
Well, could you move a little bit this way?
Very quick question, I think it can be heard. You're not only an eloquent spokesman, but you're well known for being one of the organizers of the human rights organization Law in the Service of Man. Would you comment briefly on how the uprising has impacted the work of Law in the Service of Man?
Well, the uprising, and particularly the Israeli response to it, has totally destroyed some of the basic assumptions upon which we used to work. We used to consider that there was a shared and common language of human rights, international law, and conventions to which the Israelis paid at least lip service. We knew that the Israeli government invested tremendous resources, time, and energy into building an elaborate and sophisticated charade of pretending to comply with those same values and laws and regulations. And our method of operation was to carefully document deviations and violations of these principles, and analysis of the method with which the Israelis were violating or bypassing or avoiding compliance. Since the uprising, a new policy seemed to have been instituted. The sheer magnitude and pervasiveness of human rights violation, together with the international publicity that it generated, created a new change whereby the Israeli authorities apparently no longer felt the need to keep up the pretense, no longer invested the time and the energy and the manpower required to maintain the charade, and they started to openly violate those principles. I'll give you just one example that's very concrete. Menachem Begin had made promises to Carter to curtail the use of administrative detention, including setting up an elaborate procedure whereby administrative detention will be sparsely used after internal Israeli review, only at the signature of the military governor of the entire area, to be reviewed within 96 hours by a military court judge, with right of appeal of the individual to a 3-judge panel, with periodic automatic review every 3 months. Now, within a short time, Menachem Begin discontinued administrative detention entirely. It was reinstated in 1985 by Defense Minister Rabin. And at that time, we published a booklet describing the procedures, showing that in fact they did not amount to judicial review, that they were just a sophisticated charade, and that administrative detention violates principles of the rule of law as well as other legal and international principles. Since the beginning of the uprising, however, when there were about 40 people in administrative detention, the Israelis started massively using it. I read in the paper 2 days ago that 950 people are now under administrative detention, including 4 of the field researchers of Law in the Service of Man, our own organization. They also announced that they had canceled all these elaborate machinations which pretended to give judicial review. Now there is no need for periodic review, for confirmation. A low-level officer can issue the orders and are issuing them routinely. So that as a human rights organization, in addition to feeling individually, as individuals and as an organization, threatened by the new Israeli clampdown, we also must consider entirely new approaches. We no longer can or need to document specific violations. The media is doing that much better than we are. We must now consider the dangers of massacres, of massive violations, and the possibility that what is occurring there constitutes war crimes and crimes against humanity, not just mere violations of international law here and there. So that our whole method of operations had to drastically change.
You have a question right here?
My name is Martin Kreisberg. Certainly the events that you speak of indicate that a revolution is underway, and that is certainly heady stuff. But anything beyond that requires both political structure and economic resources and economic structure. Could you indicate the economic viability then of the Gaza Strip?
By itself, it doesn't have any. Excuse me?
Long-term economic viability of the Gaza Strip.
The Gaza Strip by itself doesn't have any long-term economic viability. joined with the West Bank into a Palestinian state, it will have about as much economic viability as the state of Israel does.
Al? Take the mic, please.
Al Durasso. I'm grappling with a little paradox. I think it's a paradox you've presented us with. On the one hand, you say that the PLO derives its legitimacy, et cetera, from the fact that it represents and reflects what the people in the West Bank, Gaza Strip think and want and aspect. On the other hand, you just said, in answer to a question, you hope that it will be infected with the spirit, the audacity, et cetera, that is reflected in the actions of the uprising. I'm having trouble with those two.
Okay, let me explain. When the uprising started, the people who started it were children out in the streets who did not have more than 11th grade education, for the simple reason that the Tawjihi students do not usually participate in those things. They study hard all the time. They presented a challenge to their parents, to their leadership, to their institutions. They seemed to totally bypass all the well-known figures, the spokespeople, the individuals who in the past had led demonstrations or activities. In a sense, they were separate from the rest of their families and society. But in another sense, they were an integral part of us. I consider myself to be part of the older generation, young as I am, compared to those children. They were saying things that I dared not say or do. Now, it took a while, not very long, for their revolution to be my and our revolution. It spread slowly but surely to the other elements of society. And that does not mean that those children were ever separate from or different from the rest of society. They were our children. But they presented a challenge to their teachers, to their parents, to trade unions, to doctors, to institutions, and indirectly also to the Palestinian people in the diaspora outside and to the leadership outside. Now, how each of us responds to this challenge depends on our restrictions. The grown-ups did not go out in the street to throw rocks. The doctors didn't do that. But the doctors, through medical relief committees, started going out sometimes to the homes where the wounded were to treat them, who were afraid to come to the hospitals. Others started organizing committees for providing food. Teachers began to work on Palestinian curriculum, and so on and so forth. Palestinians who are Israeli citizens are also being infected with that germ. How they will respond must, of necessity, be different from how we in the occupied territories have responded and will continue. And as this germ slowly infects Palestinians outside, they will also act, but they will act differently. And the leadership also will act as they get infected, but they will act differently. The fact that this process takes time and that it reflects itself in different manifestations in different places does not detract from the fact that we are one people and that we have a common destiny. So I reject a dichotomy that says you on the inside and they on the outside. We are one people. I mean, the people who are deported today from Beta village are part of the Palestinian people. The fact that they are now on the outside does not disqualify them or make them somehow different from people on the inside. But their struggle is going to be different. And how they will manifest it may take different functions. So please don't take what I said to mean that somehow Arafat or Hawatmi or anybody else still hasn't caught the spirit. That's not the issue. The issue is for this new revolutionary change that is still taking place. I mean, even within the West Bank and Gaza, we are still discovering day by day, mostly helped along by Israeli repression, to develop and work out what does this mean. It's really, on the one hand, very intoxicating stuff. On the other hand, it's also very painful and tragic stuff, because we are paying through serious suffering, through hardship, through martyrs, through people whose bones are broken and crushed, through communities that are under total curfew. We are paying daily the price, and we are learning and discovering what does it mean to want to be free that badly. And how do we arrive at that? I'm sure we will make mistakes. I suspect there may be even setbacks. And I know that the time will come when we will be desperate for more help from the outside than we are now. It's a process. What I'm saying is this process must be understood, and that the other players must respond to it and act in its spirit. And mostly, I think that the Israelis must come to terms with it. For a long time, the Israeli attitude had been reflected by somebody like Raful Itan, who made that racist remark, about Palestinians are like drug cockroaches in a bottle. What could they do? People were horrified, they said it's racist, and it is. But the point that he was saying is that they are helpless. Why should we make peace with them? Why should we make concessions to them? That in fact we are worried about the Arab-Israeli conflict, about those missiles that are being traded back and forth between Iraq and Iran, about the ultimate conflagration that could occur in that area. I think now maybe we have helped them to look directly at us, at the Palestinians, and hopefully challenge them to come to terms with us, because here's the real paradox. Weak as we are the only ones who can ensure Israel's security, who can diffuse the threat of that Arab-Israeli war, who can, by granting Israel recognition, legitimacy, and acceptance, ensure its security in a way that no military power and stockpiling of arms can do. Now, it may be nice to think that we will do that to begin with, but I suspect it's unrealistic. This is the concession that we will have to make, but we will not make it simply in order for the Israelis to deign to sit and negotiate with us.
Here.
Thank you. Ofra Light from Reeve. Much was made in reports from the Uprising about the religious inspiration and element in these groups, the significance of the Friday prayers that... the significance of the Friday prayers. If I understand you correctly, you do not belong to the religious, fundamentalist Islamic part of this uprising. I wonder if you would care to speak a little bit about it, and also how you see it playing in the long run. How do you see what you've just said? Are you also speaking for more religious people than yourself?
Yeah. Well, the Israeli authorities tried at the beginning to emphasize the religious fundamentalist elements. And in fact, there are such elements, and they are more significant in Gaza than in the West Bank. But one of the features of the Intifada has been to bring together those elements together with the more secular nationalists. And one of the salient features also of the Intifada has been that Sunday morning prayers in churches have become as significant in Beit Jala, Beit Sahur, Ramallah. Routinely, they are followed by demonstrations, just as Friday morning prayers have been. The leaflets have consistently spoken about the churches and the mosques, have designated Sundays and Fridays as days of demonstrations, because every place where Palestinians gather together, and usually church or mosque is one of those places, becomes a point of focal interest. I'll tell you one method in which the Israelis tried unsuccessfully to raise that issue. I believe it was leaflet number 8. I was watching the Israeli Arabic television news, and the interviewer asked the Muslim leader, the paralyzed fellow who is considered to be the leader of the fundamentalist movement in Gaza. They brought him the pamphlet and says, look at this pamphlet. As a Muslim, how do you like the fact that it does not begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim? His answer was very good. He said, as a Muslim, of course, I would like for it, as every other paper, to begin with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. However, this is not a fundamental difference. We are all one people, and we are all in this struggle together. Leaflet number 9 came out with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim at the top. So I think people are mature and aware of what is happening. The Muslim fundamentalist movement is a factor, an element in this Intifada, just as Fatah, PFLP, and every other organization is an element in the Intifada. But the Intifada is more than the sum total of all these elements. It's an entire people that want to be free, and that are acting together, and that are consciously preventing any element from dominating. I was told by one group that the local committee in that refugee camp is composed of 7 individuals, 4 of the major parties in the PLO, 2 independents, and 1 Muslim fundamentalist. He said, even though we can't stand that fellow, but he is in here with us because we need to have unity. And part of the unity is that nobody is allowed to act independently, to claim credit for the Intifada, to publish their own leaflets. Everybody works together as one.
Jonathan, it's a desperate search for a first step to break the cycle of violence, more repression, because we know historically that that leads to some kind of horrible ultimate confrontation. Is it too late for local elections, for municipal elections, so that there will be democratically elected leaders, as has happened in the past, which can take some of the responsibility for local issues in an interim arrangement in moving toward the some kind of autonomous stage?
Well, I think the real issue is going to be whether any steps are being taken in good faith or not. I can think of many steps the Israelis can undertake right now to de-escalate. The problem with a step like the one you suggested is that people will be wondering, is this an attempt to create or bypass the Palestinian leadership, or is it a genuine attempt to get out of the impasse? The Israelis have had many opportunities in the past to hold these elections, and their refusal to hold them was predicated precisely on the fact that they don't want genuinely nationalist forces to come around. to come about. Israeli protestations that they cannot deal with the PLO but are looking for alternative leadership, I think are false, because they've done everything they could during the last 20 years to eliminate any local leadership. Right now, the policy of arresting, deportation, administrative detention is aimed at denying and prohibiting the rise of any local leadership. So that if Israel genuinely wanted to de-escalate, there are many steps it can take. Elections may be one of them. Well, one of the first is to release administrative detainees, to suspend the restrictions on the right of organization and freedom of speech, to stop the curfews that are right now paralyzing large sectors of the West Bank, to begin to ease up and remove restrictions instead of trying to crush them. On the political level, they can announce their willingness, qualify it as they wish, condition it as they wish, to deal with Palestinian nationalism under whatever conditions they may choose. Express in principle their willingness to accept Palestinian statehood, to accept withdrawal within any conditions they wish, to stop the process of colonization, building of settlements, to remove the arbitrary measures that are now being conducted. Any one or all of the above can help improve the situation. Instead, the trend has been to move in the opposite direction, to use more restrictions, to prohibit freedoms, to prevent political organization or self-expression, to publicly deny and reject any possibility of compromise with Palestinian nationalism. Even Peres and his Labour Party, as they talk about the possibility of exchanging land for peace, are emphatic that it is not with the Palestinians but with the Jordanians, it is not with the PLO, it is not from Jerusalem, it is not at the expense of settlements, it is not over all of the occupied territories but the densely populated areas. It will not entail any kind of Palestinian sovereignty at all. So with that attitude and those statements and those measures, I think Palestinians will be right to be suspicious of any attempt at municipal elections. Not that we will reject them. I think if elections are permitted and are held, people will run, will move into office, and then will simply state that the PLO is our representative. They will negotiate on our behalf. We will not do so.
Jonathan, you've really enlightened the debate today and certainly taught us a lot about how it looks from the Palestinian perspective. We wish you well on your trip home. And for those of you who are coming next week to hear Focus on Syria on Tuesday, we will begin at 9:15 instead of at 9:45. Thank you.
If you'd like more information, you can write to the Brookings Institution at 1775 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. You can stay tuned in to C-SPAN's unique public affairs programming by following these pointers.